And there we go. Okay, so again, welcome back everybody to the last session of the day. Again, remember the basic instructions, 20 minutes for the speakers, and then we will have our Q&A at the end of the session. Our chair today is going to be Professor Eloise Ade, who is a professor here at the Department of Medieval Studies. Eloise defended her PhD thesis on the Limul's Chronicle and the beginnings of Czech national historiography in the vernacular language at Paris Pantheon-Sorbonne and Paris-Sorbonne University in 2011. After working with the Humboldt, Goethe universities and CEFRES in Prague, she led a research project from 2015 to 2018 on the Europe of the Luxembourg dynasty, governance, delegation, and participation between region and empire from 1308 to 1437. In 2020, she was awarded the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship from St. Louis University in Brussels for her project on the emergence of nation thematization and instrumentalization in Europe by comparing in urbanized Brabant and feudal Bohemia from the 1300s to 1450. So, Eloise, the floor is yours, and we're very happy to have you here in our conference.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you also for inviting me and taking part to your event. So now I will present our first speaker, Peter Färberböck. He has studied history at the University of Salzburg. There he is part of the Interdisciplinary Research Center for the Medieval and Early Modern period, and works with the Institute for Medieval and Early Modern Material Culture. He's part of the Graduate College Interdisciplinary Research of Historical Culture, Historical Cultures, which is, among others, a cooperation between these two. And there he works on his PhD thesis on the historical development of the medievalism blood magic in video games. He's also part of the working group Historical Science and Digital Games. And today he will have a contribution entitled Pressing Keys, Holding Buttons, and Literally Throwing Spells, the Performative Act of Casting Black Magic Spells. So the floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and sorry for those complicated and long institutions I'm part of. I know it. So thank you for coming, and thank you for the invitation. Today I'm going to talk about pressing keys, holding buttons, and literally throwing spells, or to keep it short, just the performative act of casting black magic spells. And I think some of you might have in your brains one thought, hold on a bit, why performative act in video games? Well, let's look at why. First, on an intuitive way. That sounds rather intuitive, doesn't it? Because we have some kind of genre called role-playing games. Players are playing or performing acts because they are assuming a role, which they play and they even embody. But there are further things like the history of performances in performance studies and the history of studying video games is quite akin to each other. The questions and problems of performances in theater at the beginning of the 20th century could be applied nearly verbatim to video games now. Those are quite different media, but they had to withstand very similar questions and reproaches, such as video game still face them to some extent. I quote Erika Fischer-Lichte. She wrote about the effect of an actress playing the role of Electra from a performance in 1903. So it's quite some time ago. The strong influence on the senses and nerves changed the physical state, and in that sense procured for the first time of for the time of the performance a bodily or physical transformation. So let's switch words and switch performance with video games, and we could also describe such a change when playing video games as well. Why is that GIF not loading? Well, imagine that guy over there pulling up a book and praising things. We could also describe such a change when playing video games, as I already said. But let's look deeper into the concept and why performances in video games are really a thing. Why could they describe this as that? Melanie Fritsch called a chapter in her PhD thesis on performance and performativity tangly roots, or in German wirres Wurzelwerk. And it's quite a tangled mess because performance can already mean two things: an act in, for example, in theater, or an act of speech, as John Austin has coined the phrase in linguistics. Furthermore, those terms are widely and very differently used. Those terms are widely and differently used throughout various disciplines. So we are talking about performance from very different views. Here, we're talking about the act, but however, in a rather virtual theater. There are two essential aspects which Fischer-Lichte has coined for, that it makes up the performative art in itself, called theater. First, the co-presence of other bodies is essential. Second, the speech acts are still a constituting factor for those events. And when looking at video games, we are also having co-presence of other bodies. Non-playable characters talk to playable characters, or we or the players talk to non-playable characters. Furthermore, speech acts are also there because we talk to non-playable characters. So both can be found in video games. But how can we put that into practice, and can we even do that? Melanie Fritsch approves, and well, I agree. We could do that by using players, rephrasing players, renaming players into co-producers, which is Fischer-Lichte's designation for performances and how the audience can be part of a performance or can even produce a performance. Players manipulate games, they listen to things, so they are producers and recipients both. Furthermore, they can also design their own experience by either gaming the system. I think many of you may know that players tend to exploit things in games and do things which normally you shouldn't, or which games aren't designed for, like playing an action game called Grand Theft Auto 5, which has been sold for, I think, over 100 million times, and they're role-playing in there. So quite a different setting from what is really used. And they also have one problem that both have in common. Performances cannot be saved. They cannot be recorded. They cannot be documented, as performance studies scientist Peggy Phelan once said. Well, that can always also be said of video games. We can record them in video, but do they have the same quality? Every ludic aspect is omitted in a simple video recording. So let's once again go deeper and look at the theory of why video games can be seen as performances, at least to the four aspects which Melanie Fritsch has caused, I heavily lean on her. Sorry, Melanie, for that. First, it's embodiment. Players play by performing physical acts, such as pressing buttons on peripherals, moving around with the hand, moving a mouse, or even moving a virtual reality controller. They interact, or they even control the virtual body as an extension of the real body. But there is more in embodiment. It's not just a bodily experience, it's also a sensorial experience. So we hear things, we see things, we listen to things, we comprehend things. It's more than just the physical way of interacting. Second part is games can be seen as concept of possibility. Every time we play, we do it a different way. It's a once in a lifetime unique experience, a unique interaction. Thirdly, it's a rather aesthetic experience, as we've already heard in a few talks before. But it's also this also means that it's not a unidirectional interaction. The game or designer provide things, but the players can manipulate these things. They can change these things up. And last but not least, eventfulness, which means that the players are quite that the self-efficacy of players is more important than the experience itself. The things what really happen. To coin it into casting black magic, it's not important what people cast, what players cast, but it's important that they cast black magic. Let's go to the analytical part of how that can work out, how game feel as analytical method can work. Fridge modified game field from game design from Steve Swink and added 5 further parts. But first, let's look at the game field from a design perspective. I quote, "Real-time control of virtual objects in a simulated space with interactions emphasized by polish." So we have real-time control of virtual objects. That's a thing we can relate to. We have a simulated space, once again, quite clear. But what is polish? Polish means details like a fireball which emits smokes, or it burns things, or it isn't just a solid object. It can be formed. So it's those details we are looking at as well. But game field doesn't really mean that everything from that definition has to be there all the time, and it doesn't have to have equal focus. So when we look at a turn-based game instead of a real-time game, it still can be looked at via game field. So that's for the free design aspect, but the player experience has more than that. It has 5 aspects of experiences, which once again starts with embodiment. I'll omit that as we have already talked about embodiment quite a bit. Secondly, we have skills. Players are learning, they are practicing, and they are mastering skills while playing. I'll go into an example in Divinity Original Sin later on, where we can see what really skills means. Here, we are not talking about immersion, but rather talking about extension of the senses and extension of identity. So we are talking of extensions of their own body, extensions of their own senses, because we don't disappear into the games as immersion might connote, but we incorporate ourselves into the game. First, the extension of the senses means something like a player gets a feeling of their own character. They perceive that character as distinct body. Extension of identity is some kind of the next level. They eventually identify with their character. And last but not least, there is also the ludic aspect, the interaction. We interact with the physical reality of the game. And now I'm coming back to the topic at first. Sorry for that theoretic rant. We cast spells. Players cast spells, black magic spells. So let's look at what could that method deliver for historical game studies and why I'm really talking about that whole theory. Let's look at black magic as an example, but sorry for that. One step back, still a theory is missing. What is black magic? Why is it the so-called dark arts of magic? Some of you, or many of you, may know that it's Greek, necromantia, meaning divination involving death for the dead, some kind of sorcery of witchcraft. However, in popular culture, but also in history, they mixed things up. They used Latin, nigra, nigrum, which means black, and there you are, from necromancy came up black magic with black books, and we are casting simple spells which are harmful or even deadly. At least for games, we can still state that black magic is connoting with we are doing harmful and deadly magic. Furthermore, it is strongly connoted with deviancy. Black magic is never positive, it's always negative. It's against the faith and it's against the church. And talking about faith and church, divinity isn't far, so let's jump into my example, Divinity Original Sin 2 Definitive Edition, a mouthful. We could also say that it's sorcerers against the divine order, and that typo is intentional. It's really derived from source. This is a role-playing game, and it's about an energy called source, which is forbidden. It's necessary for extremely powerful magical spells. Even the 7 gods draw their power from source in this game. However, as I've said, source is forbidden. When somebody uses the source, this calls up some creatures called the Voidwoken, which are monsters. And furthermore, the divine order, here we have the faith and the church against it, hunts sorcerers and they put them into a kind of jail. And of course, the protagonist is able to cast source magic. So concerning magic, how does performance hold up here? Let's look at embodiment. Players control one character of D6, or well, more than 6. But we will come to that later. But let's say 6, or rather a whole group of characters, 4 characters out of these 6. We can combine different magic spells. We can cast them by pressing a button and combine them, which leads to rather satisfying and devastating magic combos. Even more, we embody a kind of savior figure because the protagonist's source magic can change up the destiny of the whole world, the whole fictitious world. They might even achieve divinity, spread the power via source magic to everyone in the world, or just eradicate everything from source magic. So we are a rather powerful and omnipotent figure. Furthermore, there are numerous characters to bond with, and there's a rather rich story to achieve those bondings. The next part are skills, as I've foreshadowed a few minutes ago. We are combining a whole lot of spells, and we have powers of 4 characters. Down there, I've taken a screenshot of a rather late game version with 4 characters, and those are those skills I, in this part, have chosen and I can combine whenever I want. For example, we can turn foes into ice and then smash them with a tentacle. This is the part where we learn skills by leveling up, by gaining experience, by playing hours, and we master them or we practice them by combining those different skills. We also have 8 schools of magic, classical black magic, such as elemental magic, air, earth, water, fire. Here we already have air. There is some air is here, there's water. Earth and fire I have rather omitted. There is some earth in there. And we combine them with necromancy, shapeshifting, summoning, or using source magic. Players learn them throughout the game and they master them throughout the game. The next one is extension of the senses. I've already talked about the story, which takes some part in there, but it's also their efficacy and choices. Players get a good feeling of their own character. It can be chosen from 6 predefined characters, as I already said, but one can also create their own character, which leads to extension of identity. Creating their own character might be quite a strong bond. However, there are also choices and spells can hurt friends and foe and even ourselves. So we have to be aware of our own and the bodies of the other people, or to the other people, characters. It's a rather typical or classical role-playing game. So there are loads and loads of systems which can lead to identification. And that's also concerning magic when we only look at those few skills in there. Let's stay in magic when we talk about interaction. That is a rather strong suit of Divinity Original Sin 2, because all those pools and corpses and barrels in there can be interacted with and can be used for explosions, spreading poison, amplifying and spreading magic. So casting a lightning bolt on a water or blood pool is deadly for the whole area. Players can even cast rain, as we can see there, to make friends or foes wet, which once again can be used for other spells. So there are various magic spells and various different objects we can interact with and try to manipulate. Down there, we can see some magic spells which I've chosen for, like teleportation. We can teleport other people around, or other characters around whenever we want. Now I'm going for my last slide. So I have missed the time. How much time do I have still?
You have around 4 minutes.
4 minutes, perfect. Then let's make it a bit more fleshed out than those few points in there. Looking ahead, my concluding ramblings, which are, well, rather flexible how long I can take. What can we really do with performance? What can we do? First, we can look into magic and virtual reality, because performance is a tool to analyze casting actual magic in a virtual experience. It rather elegantly tackles the immersive fallacy that we are cast into a virtual reality, so we could think that it's immersive. As I've already said, immersive is, well, it's difficult. So there are other aspects of performance that clearly tell us that immersion is problematic and can be used with different aspects, or can be bygone with different aspects. Secondly, we can look at participant observations. So we can make a performance framework, and it may performance may give us an insight why participants do things in video games and how they do things and what they feel when doing that. Then there's also the effect of casting magic, because, well, most of us may agree magic is rather a fictitious theme. But in medieval times, it was, at least in their minds, a rather real thing. And also in games, it is a rather real thing. So we can look at this part. This is sustainability of historic game studies. I've already coined a bit, because I was talking about recording video games. How can we record video games? When we look at them as performances, we might see different aspects than just, well, writing down a footnote with a citation, see game XY, and I don't know where really, and what I've really done before. Lastly, that's a rather ambitious one, but we could perhaps, and that's I think for the discussion, tackle the historical correctness and toxic communities thing we've, well, most of us will know, because, well, there are mind-boggling interpretations of what Middle Ages are and how they should be depicted in video games. And as soon as we see those interpretations, these preposterous discussions as a kind of performance, we might analyze them in a different way, and we might even counterpoint them by using these topic. And that's it. And I hope I could make clear how performance and video games could work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this very interesting contribution. So we will discuss that after the three speakers will have held their contribution. So now I will introduce our second speaker, Shreya Prasad. She's a research scholar at Center for English Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And she's primarily interested in the unique ways fantasy literature, especially high fantasy, navigates postmodern loss of truth, stability, and meaning within its seemingly utopic form. She's currently writing a PhD thesis titled Playing with Catastrophe, Neo-Medieval Fantasy in the Age of New Media, a part of which will be presented now. And her contribution deals with neo-medieval fantasy in the age of new media. So the word is yours, Shreya.
Thank you for that kind introduction. So I am a scholar of literary studies. So my presentation would reflect that. Actually, I am quite interested in how signs of Middle Ages are evoked within the form of fantasy, and how the form itself defines what kind of Middle Ages then get reflected in fantasy. Give me a quick second here. Now, the paper that I am presenting today is titled The GOT Phenomena, Investigating Neo-Medieval Fantasy in the Age of New Media. Middle Ages have been used and abused ever since its segregation as a distinct entity at the cusp of early modern period to suit the ideological agenda of the time. Whether it is to justify connection to a great ancient past of Greece and Rome through distancing the Middle Ages, or reclaiming it to construct a distinct national identity during European medieval imperialism, the Middle Ages have acted as a liminal space, suspended between reality and fiction. While the Middle Ages have been used as an empty sign where significance is repeatedly scripted by its use in various genres and modes. In the current popular culture, its use in the fantasy genre is perhaps most perceptible. After the tremendous success of Game of Thrones, there's proliferation of shows with quasi-medieval settings like Witcher, Cursed, Shannara Chronicles, and upcoming releases like House of Dragons and Rings of Power. While there is renewed interest in high fantasy set in completely isolated secondary world, it cannot be denied that the current popular fantastic imagination is obsessed with a particular kind of intrigue-filled Middle Ages. This paper will argue that the shift in the imagined fantastic landscape is symptomatic of a larger shift informed by changing production and consumer patterns in the impulse of fantasy proposed by J.R.R. Tolkien. Though Tolkien by no means invented the genre of fantasy, his works, both fictional and theoretical, were crucial in raising fantasy from its esoteric origins, becoming the backbone of the genre itself. By investigating the shift in the impulse of fantasy in A Song of Ice and Fire and its HBO adaptation, Game of Thrones, as a function of evolution of new media, I want to highlight some of the reasons why we're moving towards a gritty Middle Ages. Now, the world of Song of Ice and Fire is far from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Unlike the picturesque and benign lands of Middle-earth, the lands of Westeros and Essos are hostile with dangers of monsters and men at every turn. The ever-threatening surrounding is translated onto the body, not only in terms of violence, but the capacity of the body to be soiled. Thus, the gritty realism of these texts, marked by dirt, mud, blood, that indicates the fallibility of the human body is tied to the plausibility of defeat. Such an imagination, in the name of verisimilitude, encourages a particular disenchanted worldview where final triumph is not a given. Contrasted with the utopian setting of Lord of the Rings, the supposed center of the genre of fantasy, such imagination seems more realistic, more authentic. But these worlds are hardly a reference to lived Middle Ages. They are removed from them temporally, being written in 20th and 21st century, as well as being self-proclaimed work of fancy. Tolkien and Martin may claim a relationship with the past, but they're deliberately using it for their particular ends. Now, fantasy occupies a very unique position. It is informed by contemporaneity, but not bound by it. Catherine Hume in Fantasy and Mimesis argued that literature, and by extension all fiction, lies somewhere between the two poles of mimesis and fantasy. They are fundamental operations of narrative imagination and cannot exist without the other. Mimesis harbors, quote begins, desire to imitate, to describe events, people, situations, and objects with such verisimilitude that others can share your experience, quote ends. Whereas fantasy has the desire, quote begins, to change givens, alter reality out of boredom, play, vision, longing for something lacking, or need for metaphoric images that will bypass the audience's verbal defenses, close quote. Informed by these dual desires, fantasy can shift contemporary concerns to an imagined location and find a resolution that may not be probable or even possible in the real world. Consider press or expel desires, it can also generate them by revealing the possibility of an alternate order, an alternate reality. For Tolkien, this alternate reality can be glimpsed through fairy. Now, theorizing about fantasy in his seminal lecture in 1938 called On Fairy Stories, Tolkien claimed that fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Now, such a worldview is important to Tolkien as it firstly provides a recuperative escape from limitations of life. Secondly, attempts recovery of clarified worldview. And lastly, and most importantly, gives consolation of a happy ending. Just like tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, Tolkien called consolation of a happy ending through a coined term he calls eucatastrophe, the true form of fairy story. Describing eucatastrophe, eu as in good and catastrophe turn of events, he says, in its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond walls of walls of the world, poignant as grief. This view of fantasy as a means to deny your final defeat, to restore hope to a disillusioned world, is the primary impulse of fantasy. Now, Tolkien's peculiar medievalism, informed by his scholarship in Anglo-Saxon literature, as well as exposure to 19th century British medieval revival, is sufficiently mapped by studies in medievalism. But what I want to stress is that at the heart of Tolkien's medievalism was a need to search for meaning in what Tom Shippey called monstrous 20th century. It was with this intention Tolkien borrows science of romance literature with its quest motive to create a quasi-medieval world. But Tolkien's resolution is not without cause or nuance. Frodo, at the end of his quest, is so scarred by the corruptive powers of the ring that he is unable to destroy it. It is Gollum, the dark double of Frodo, who, in his greed, becomes the cause of the ring's destruction. It is in that unexpected, sudden way the resolution occurs almost as a function of chance that fantasy has the potential to script the threat of defeat into moments of resolution. Cinderella may go off to live a perfect life with her prince without any loss, but Shire itself is scourged in the process of defeating Sauron. And even when it is rebuilt, Frodo can never go back to that idyllic landscape. Thus, fantasy does not deny exploration of discatastrophe, of sorrows of life. Rather, it constructs a space of such exploration, which, while bestowing bestows a resolution that is self-reflexive without being self-destructive. Now, much of contemporary fantasy can be found lodged between the longing of a promised meaningful unity and a recognition of its own impossibility, incorporating contemporary concerns within a hopeful frame. Writers of fantasy have pushed its boundaries by complicating dualities of good and bad, as in the case of Earth-Sea Cycle, incorporating themes of gender and marginalization in, say, the left hand of darkness or fledgling, and have even gone so far as to question the healing capacity of the magical universe in The Magician. George R.R. Martin's departure from tropes and conventions of fantasy by adding moments of discatastrophe or darker themes of betrayal, violence, and disillusionment is not new. What is unique about Martin's peculiar way of doing fantasy is that it breaks the form of fantasy open, making the possibility of rehabilitation through eucatastrophe impossible. Now, the thinning of the moral fabric of Westeros is not because of an external threat of White Walkers, the zombie-like creatures within the text who wish to plunge Westeros into an eternal winter, but because of an internal one. The state of the noble houses locked in a struggle for power, consumed by their own greed. While the traditional external threat can be easily defeated, winning a war against White Walkers or even establishing a good monarch on the Iron Throne will not set things right. The history of monarchy in Westeros, going as far back as 12,000 years, is that of cyclical conflict, rife with conquest, mutiny, war, and bloodshed, where monarchs, both good and bad, have repeatedly failed to provide peace and stability. With no reference point in the past to restore, healing of the world through eucatastrophe is impossible. In banishing resolution and the possible generation of meaning, Martin distorts the form of fantasy, shifting its impulse from consolation of a happy ending to a playful subversion of reader expectation. Martin has always maintained that his inversion of tropes of fantasy is an attempt to move away from Disneyland representation of Middle Ages. Discussing the role of history in conceptualizing Westeros, Marsden once said in an interview, ruling is very hard. You have to make a lot of hard decisions, and sometimes there is no answer to the problems confronting your country or its people. It's not enough just to be a good or strong or well-intentioned. You have to solve problems. Actually, if you look at English history or even French history, the kings who were best were pretty appalling human beings in a lot of ways, end quote. Though good lords and ladies make terrible kings and politicians in Westeros, the appalling kings are hardly better. While Targaryen kings were cruel, the Andals and the First Men were not better either. Martin has always maintained that he wanted to move away from Tolkienian fantasy land to represent a more authentic Middle Ages that can lay bare the mechanisms of repressive authoritarian power. But these three classes, the three classes that are most repressed, that is the small folk, that is the peasants, the slaves, and the women, are fetishized within both A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones to further their grimdark imagination. The small folk and slaves never become a narrator within the novels. The slaves are racialized in Game of Thrones, and though both the show and the novels have strong, complex female characters, their significance is deeply undermined by gratuitous sex and sexualized violence, both in the novels and the show. The paradoxical foregrounding of violence on the marginalized, yet overshadowing of their subjectivity, is tied up with Martin's agenda of creating a world that disorients the reader. Both A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones have a deliberate relationship to the past, the actual Middle Ages, that promote this disorientation. At the level of world building, Martin mixes anachronistic elements like Celtic First Men, Anglo-Saxon Andals, Norman Targaryens, early modern globalized economy, and proto-corporations to create a simulacrum of Middle Ages where original significance of these medieval signs are moot. Jean Baudrillard, in theorizing about representations in postmodern world, in Simulacra and Simulation, defines simulacrum as an image that precedes reality. He says, quote begins, "The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none," end quote. Martin has deliberately created a world of self-referential medieval signs that just point to empty codes with no real meaning beyond calling attention to itself. Such a use of Middle Ages also alters the reader audience's understanding of history. Martin isolates gruesome moments from the past, like Black Dinner or the Glencoe Massacre, which were both inspirations behind the Red Wedding, and takes them out of their context, uses them to sensationalize the reader audience. Now, the reader audience is piqued by such shocking events, and they research the Middle Ages, but only through such violence and biased reference points. While violence, misogyny existed in the Middle Ages, the extent to which they are foregrounded, the raising of agrarian resources and genocide of small folk as if it's just the way of war, or is to warp history in a fit of theme of A Song of Ice and Fire. A society that is as unstable and as oppressive as Westeros will not and cannot survive. Westeros is neo-medieval rather than medieval, where signs of the Middle Ages have no connection to their history, imagined or otherwise. Though it is heavily mediated by Martin's personal agenda, his superficial use of history steeped in verisimilitude seems real. Now, this particular grim, dark, gritty world generates historical legitimacy for representation of the Middle Ages, informed by consumer-driven commercial culture that relies on convergence of digital technologies to gain profit. HBO, the name synonymous with golden age of television, utilizes the relaxation in cable regulation towards the end of 20th century, not only to create programs with high production value and good writing, but they employed this new freedom to create content that maintained an audience through controversy. In Sex, Swearing and Respectability, quoting a controversy, HBO's original programming and producing quality TV, McCabe and Akas argued that, quote begins, quoting controversy has been institutionalized by HBO, embedded in and through its original programming as a distinctive feature of its cultural cachet, its quality brand label, and its leading market position, quote end. Thus, in order to use controversy as a tactic to gain an audience, HBO often takes plot to gruesome and sometimes unwatchable lengths. But this is not the only way GOT manages to gain popularity. The literary series and the show carefully prompt generation of hypertext through deliberate narrative ambiguities, obscuring character motivations, controversial deaths, and production decisions like shooting on location. Manenhag in Between Ice and Fire explores the pleasures created by exploration of these liminal spaces between reality and fiction through hypertext as the reason behind its success. The appeal of Game of Thrones is not only in its pretend authenticity, but in navigating the proliferation of contradictory information in a constant shifting plot line replete with death of favorite characters, unsuspecting betrayals, and suspecting betrayals. In such a world, the reader audience actively participates in the text, generating meaning by forming alliances, interpreting prophecies, and guessing the next plot twist. Concluding, this active reader audience is the new marker for measuring a fantasy show's success in the evolving forms of media. In the current converging digital landscape, success of a show is measured not only by number of views, but its capacity to transmute across media into a franchise through merchandising, spin-off movies, shows, novels, games, etc. In the wake of success of GOT, not only is the definition of successful show changing, the evolving media forms are also altering the medieval imagination to accommodate needs of multimedia universe that can engage the shortening attention span of consumers. A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones managed to capture the attention of the reader audience by transforming the trusting relationship to that of a suspicious, self-conscious one, where the reader audience is acutely aware of the frailty of their attempted meaning-making. At the heart of this exchange between the reader audience, the text, and the digital world is a negative emotion. It is within this commercialization of negative emotion through quoting controversy, fetishizing the body, through gratuitous representations of sex and violence, betraying the reader expectation or cliffhangers, that Game of Thrones shifts the eucatastrophic impulse of fantasy to a destructive play, where changing production and consumption patterns not only produce a certain kind of Middle Ages, but also produce a particular kind of content. Now, through this paper, I've tried to show that the gritty realism of Game of Thrones, marked by its moral ambiguity, well-developed characters, and explorations of the dark side of power and authority, is not only a result of postmodern loss of truth, stability, meaning. Rather, it is a carefully constructed hyper-real world informed by the changing consumption and production patterns in new media that disguises commercial interests as authenticity. Thank you.
Eloise, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting interpretation. I will now introduce our third speaker, Kevin Hoffman. Kevin Hoffman is a PhD candidate in history at Yale University and graduate curatorial intern at the Yale University Art Gallery. His dissertation focuses on the numismatic and monetary history of North Sea in the early Middle Ages, and his contribution now is entitled What is Fantasy Good For? Fantasy and the Historical Imagination. The floor is yours, Kevin.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Medievalisms on Screen team for convening this wonderful conference. Having grown up on a steady diet of fantasy and pursued a degree in Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic studies, in part due to a love of Tolkien, this conference scratches an itch that my numismatic work rarely allows. I was intrigued in part because the call for papers cited Benedetto Croce's maxim that all history is contemporary history. I would prefer to frame this talk in terms of another way of understanding contemporary history. A contemporary of Croce's, R.G. Collingwood, developed a theory of history wherein the historian reenacts the past in his own mind. If you will indulge me for the next 20 minutes, I will be assuming that this theory is true. I believe Collingwood's theory of reenactment to be defensible, but a defense of the theory is outside of the scope of this paper. This theory of historical reenactment entails two things. First, the past is truly knowable. When I read and rightly understand Augustine's writings, I am thinking the same thought Augustine was. The thought is the same. There is a fact of the matter. Second, individuals in the past are knowable. In large part, this follows on from the first point. If I can know what someone believes, I can go a considerable way to understanding that person. We share a common nature with our subjects, and they are thus intelligible, once we have made their context intelligible. This is not some hyper-rationalistic history from the armchair type theory. It is considerably more demanding than that. We must still make the context intelligible. This is done through the rigorous methods that often fall under the umbrella of history, but are better characterized as the historical auxiliary sciences. Those studies which focus on one type of data, in my case, numismatics. Collingwood was not just a philosopher of history, but an archaeologist of Roman Britain. Archaeology, or whatever auxiliary science we choose, is essential to understanding the context of our subjects, to allow us to understand their thoughts in their proper context. Even if you will grant that history is in some way reenactment, this still might seem to be a Herculean task, and I believe you would be correct in thinking that. How is it that we can possibly understand subjects who are not only different from ourselves, but also from an entirely different time? How do we train ourselves to understand our subjects? I propose that the historical imagination, in tandem with the historical auxiliary sciences, is the prime way in which we arrive at an understanding of our subjects. As a corollary to this, I suggest that the historian ought to participate in fantasy, either written, watched, or played, as it is one of the best ways of developing the imagination, which is only one step removed from the historical imagination. In order to argue for this, I will discuss primarily the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, a professor of Anglo-Saxon, and C.S. Lewis, a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature, as they were self-conscious participants in the activity of fantasy, wrote considerably about the subject, and had well-developed historical consciousnesses. While I believe that fantasy is useful for a number of reasons, I will emphasize the importance of fantasy for two ends: the personal development of the historian, and for her development as a compelling teacher. I will deal with the subject of the teacher first. But before I introduce the subject of teaching, I would like to provide a couple of brief anecdotes. I'm an avid fan of Dungeons and Dragons and have spent considerable time listening to Critical Role, which is a group of voice actors who record their sessions of Dungeons and Dragons. A friend of mine who also watches Critical Role told me after one of the characters died that she, quote, didn't think she would cry about role-playing, but here we are. Here we are indeed. Her experience isn't unique, but it should be striking to us that we can feel so strongly for characters which are not real and played by actors we don't really know. Allow me to provide one more example. When I play The Witcher: The Wild Hunt, I find myself agonizing over the moral or kindest choice. Is this because I appreciate Geralt's Kantian intuitions? Evil is evil, lesser, greater, middling, makes no difference, the degree is arbitrary? Perhaps. On one level, my agonizing is ridiculous. The characters don't exist, and the characters I do interact with in a quest are unlikely to be encountered again. Are mine and my friends' soft hearts indicative of a failure on our part, or a soft head? A character flaw, perhaps? I think not. What my friend and I are experiencing is something Tolkien called secondary belief. In his essay on fairy stories, he characterizes secondary belief not as a suspension of disbelief, but lying rather in the realm of imagination. It is a belief that what happens within the story accords with the world of the story and is therefore true within the story. This is the role of the sub-creator, Tolkien's term for the description of fantasy creators, to create a world where what occurs feels compelling within that world. My friend felt sorrow for the death of a character because of the effective immersion that Matt Mercer and the cast of Critical Role were able to create. I agonize over decisions in a game while I play the game, because the idea of a kind-hearted neutrality that Geralt strives for is admirable. The sub-creator, whether it be Matt Mercer or CD Projekt Red, has successfully created a world that generates secondary belief in the imagination of the participants. In other words, we feel what we were intended to feel. But are we as historians actually in the business of causing right feeling or only right thinking? Why is it that some historical works ring hollow despite considerable research? And how can students call history boring? I think that you may agree that many historians are simply bad sub-creators. We fail to persuade our readers and our students that our subject is worth talking about. On seeing the disinterest on students' faces or declines in enrollment, we seek to generate new interest. I think it is a wrong-headed, although well-intentioned solution to focus on presentist concerns in order to address engagement issues. I think rather that the solution lies through the historical imagination. But how do we get from the imagination to the historical imagination? The leap, Collingwood suggests, is much shorter than we might believe. To quote from his book, The Idea of History, "It is by historical thinking that we rethink and so rediscover the thoughts of Hammurabi or Solon. It is in this way that we discover the thoughts of a friend who writes us a letter or a friend who crosses the street." The great distinction between the historical imagination of Collingwood and the imaginative Tolkien's sub-creator of fantasy is that the historical imagination attempts to imagine real things. It attempts to establish primary rather than secondary belief. The historical imagination isn't the proposal of fantastical solutions to problems. It is, however, the ability to see solutions to yet unproposed problems. It is our ability to work from the data, or surviving pasts, to use the term of Michael Oakeshott, another philosopher of history, to reach back and link these surviving pasts together to create history. It is then incumbent upon us to convey why our reenactment of the past, which we produce in writing, is superior to another proposed reenactment. But a truer solution doesn't necessarily mean our audience will assent to our version of events. To be a successful sub-creator, we must not only get the story right, as it were, but we absolutely must convey feelings to our students. We all have the answer to the question why we study what we study, and I am willing to wager that most of us study something because of a love. Something about our field is lovable to us. Our sub-creation should convey this love to our students so that they can experience the same joy we do. When our love, fascination, and joy about the subject aren't conveyed, how do we expect someone to care about our work? Now, I recognize that it may be difficult to get someone to participate in the joy of my numismatic work. It is often highly technical, involving minor variations on coins. Even to me, a die study can cause my eyes to glaze over. This is where I think we need to draw a distinction between history and what have been called the historical auxiliary sciences. When I write on numismatic topics, I work as a numismatist. But when I tie this numismatic evidence back to talking about real people, suddenly I'm back into history. The sub-creator of history is much like the sub-creator of fantasy. They weave together the various building blocks, numismatics, archaeology, paleoclimatology, together to produce a compelling and intellectually satisfying account of the surviving evidence. We must bring our students along with our imagination so that they can find their own love of the subject as well. I move on to my second point concerning the personal development that may be derived from fantasy. Fantasy, it must be remembered, does not deny reality, but in fact assumes a reality. Otherwise, we would not be able to differentiate between secondary and primary beliefs. When we discuss our historical subjects, they are complete and multifaceted humans. And as such, to understand our subjects, we must understand their culture and those things which were important to them. Collingwood puts it this way, quote, "If the reasons why it is hard for a man to cross the mountains is because he is frightened of the devils in them, it is folly for the historian preaching at him across a gulf of centuries to say, this is sheer superstition. There are no devils at all. Face facts and realize there are no dangers in the mountains except rocks and water and snow, wolves perhaps and bad men perhaps, but no devils. The historian says that these are the facts because that is the way he has been taught to think. But the devil-fearer says that the presence of devils is a fact because that is the way in which he has been taught to think. The historian thinks it is a wrong way, but wrong ways of thinking are just as much historical facts as right ones. And no less than they determine the situation, always a thought situation, in which the man who shares them is placed, end quote. Remember the story of my friend. She felt sorrow because sorrow was intended to be felt. Were she to experience scorn for the characters, she would be pulled from her secondary belief. To scorn draws us further from our sources. It diminishes their humanity. The path forward is with my tearful friend. The path forward is through sympathy. Sympathy is perhaps such a common word that it may require a bit of a definition. What I mean by sympathy is simply to feel with. But what is the feeling that should be developed in the historian to make them an effective subcreator? Again, I ask your indulgence. I propose that we pursue friendship with our sources. Some of the quick-witted among you may already have an objection. What about the villains of history? Surely we can't pursue friendship with them. Your intuition is good. I promise I will address this. But there seems to me to be three postures of friendship with our sources. First and most simple of the three, I will call companionship with the wise. Second, I will call mercy to the forgotten. And third, I will call pity for the villains. First, as regards companionship with the wise, I mean those individuals which are primarily known through their literary output. As historians, we are very good at understanding our subjects in one sense. We read about our subjects all the time. We come to a great deal of understanding about what they did, but knowing our subject, knowing something about someone is different than knowing them as a person. We must read what they read, think as they think, and feel what they feel. This is much easier for prolific writers. I think of Augustine again, for instance. It is possible to sit with Augustine for months and see growth and change in his beliefs as he encountered different situations in his life. With writers like Augustine, we are presented with an overwhelming amount of his feelings, making the process of sympathy merely a process of patience and understanding. The prolific, so long as they are not intending to deceive, make the process of historical imagination more straightforward. But what about those who remain nameless? The peasant, the slave, the serf. To understand their experience, we must do a little more than read their writings. To understand, we must exercise our historical imagination. The means by which we exercise our historical imagination is by analogy. The modern soldier, for example, can understand the medieval knight in a way the historian in her armchair cannot. The fear, the adrenaline, the sights, the scents, the sounds are not seared into most of our minds. This does not, of course, mean that every military historian must have seen war. It only means that the analogies that she uses in her historical imagination to understand her subject will be further removed from that of her subject. Naturally, this does in some ways place a primacy on the individual rather than the collective. I don't mean to denigrate here the social and cultural influences upon our subjects, but in recognizing their individuality, we gain a sympathy for our subject on account of our shared humanity. It would be difficult then to think of them as anything other than sharing in the dignity of their humanity. The third category is the most difficult, and I will spend the rest of my time on the topic of pity for the villains. This might seem obvious, but to identify the villains of history, the historian is implicitly identifying a moral standard to which they adhere. The historian must thus possess a degree of moral clarity in order to identify a villain. If the historian is to be, to any extent, a truth teller, they must not wish their villain to be worse than they are. Consider these words from C.S. Lewis. Suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper. Then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the story might not be quite true, or not quite so bad as it were made out. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even they aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment, and even a determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemies are as bad as possible. If it is the second, then it is, I am afraid, the first step in a process which, if followed to the end, will make us into devils. Close quote. The historian must be clear-eyed and not exaggerate. Does this mean that we are to try to make the villains less bad than they actually are? Of course not. We must be clear. Hayden White, another philosopher, may be particularly helpful here. When we write of villains, perhaps it might be best to write in the mode of tragedy. We are not writing a vindication or a monumental history, but it is a tragedy that the villains were, in fact, villains. However, once we identify our villain, we must simultaneously recognize their humanity. As is the case of mercy towards the forgotten, we must remember that the villains that we identify are still humans and still deserving of the dignity accorded to their nature. We must recognize that there is nothing essential to their nature that made them the villain of the story we are choosing to tell. A series of historical accidents has made it so. We cannot be so self-assured of our own righteousness that we would be certain that had we been born elsewhere and elsewhen, that we would be the hero of the histories that would follow. Why then do I suggest pity as the posture we ought to take towards the villains of history? Pity does not lose sight of either the evil that was done or the humanity of the villain. It suggests a right feeling of wishing the villains were not so villainous and the night were not so dark, while still recognizing that it is so. While the word does not occur in Tolkien's account of fairy stories, it is a feature of his very own fairy story, The Lord of the Rings, and I take that to be significant. First, pity is a reflection of the character of the giver, in our case, the historian, and reflects the understanding of the situation. When Aragorn offered only pity to Éowyn when she offered love, Faramir responds, "Do not scorn pity that is the gift of a gentle heart." Aragorn could not offer love, but felt pain that he could not offer what she desired. It is only on account of Aragorn's sympathy that he can pity. Elsewhere, Tolkien states that it is pity that kept Bilbo and Sam from killing Gollum. Pity stems from an acknowledgement that the situation could have been otherwise. Second, pity is exclusive. Faramir pitied Éowyn's sorrow, and Aragorn pitied her for loving one who could not love her as she deserved. But Faramir's pity was replaced by love. Pity thus in some ways excludes a love, a considerable boon if we are to contend that we ought to pity the villain. Pity likewise excludes scorn. In the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien describes Faramir reading the hearts of men as shrewdly as his father, but what he read moved him sooner to pity than to scorn. He was gentle in bearing and a lover of lore and music. It is perhaps interesting that in his letters, Tolkien describes Faramir as the character which he is most like. We return to the beginning, to my kind-hearted friend. I think that there is much that the historian has to learn from those who feel deeply and feel rightly. I hope that I have made a case for fantasy that does not sound saccharine. What then is the value of fantasy to the historian? In conclusion, I summarize my argument in 3 parts. First, it teaches us to be good sub-creators. Second, it teaches us to sympathize with those whose experiences differ from our own. And third, it teaches us to pity the villain and wish that they could have been other than they are. So ought the historian participate in fantasy? How could she not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you to our 3 speakers. Now we have time for a discussion. Maybe to begin, I would have a question for Shreya. I was very interested in the way how you presented the tension between mimesis and fantasy, which generates a desire for an alternative to an alternate order, and how Game of Thrones is supposed to create a new space for imagining new possibilities. And my question would be, is the audience aware of that? And if, I don't know, maybe it's not an interesting question, but I was very interested in that. And then, you know, the development of this what you were saying. And so, yes, is the audience aware of these possibilities, and do studies, analysis exist on the reception of Game of Thrones?
I'm sorry, I could not get the last part of your question. I got the first one.
Yeah.
The last part of your question. The first
Yeah.
one was, is the audience aware of the...
Yes. Yeah, and the second question is it's connected with that. If this question, the reception of Game of Thrones, is analyzed, studied, I don't know if some scholars already discussed that, and yeah, but some testimonies, you know, of the reception of Game of Thrones.
Okay, so the first part of your question, that is the audience aware of the alternate reality or the alternate order or resolution that fantasy scripts? And I think they most definitely are, though not to the extent that theory does deal with it, but just the appeal of fantasy itself, right? Where you get into a world which does have its own concerns. I mean, it does relate to primary world quite a bit, and it then resolves those issues. So in that resolution itself, the reader is aware of the alternate orders that it generates. In that sense, then it generates a desire for something that, a desire itself for resolution. And within coming to Game of Thrones, in the way that he shifts that desire, I think just the discourse of how much people appreciated this realistic imagination of Martin does point towards that shift, the distinct way that Martin shifts away from fantasy. And it does speak to how the kind of representations we want to see and we want to read. The second part of your question, whether such receptions have been theorized, and where I'm picking my sources. So while I was reading about Game of Thrones and the Song of Ice and Fire, part of my research, I was just surprised by the parallels between how Baudrillard talks about simulacrum and our own fatal strategies of negotiating a simulated hyperreal world, and the reader's strategies of making sense of the text. And that is where I am drawing that parallel. I hope that somewhat makes sense.
Thank you very much. I see that Juan Manuel has a question.
Well, first of all, thank all of the three of you for your papers. Those were very, very interesting. I have just like one comment for Shreya, and I have a question for Kevin. Again, it's something that I wrote in the chat, but I would like to say I really appreciate this idea that you introduced of this idea of the simulacrum that disorients, right? Because it feels very closely to something that I'm working on, the case of The Witcher. Because the case of The Witcher, every time that I have read the books or played the games, it's weird when you're reading The Witcher and you find Cinderella or the story of Snow White inside of the book, because it kind of takes you out. It feels too close to yourself in actually to be fantasy. Like that disorientation is something that, again, you gave me a lot to think about it, because I think it makes a lot of sense of how The Witcher portrays the Middle Ages itself through this disorientation that is very close to heart. So I would first want to say that comment. And now I have a question for Kevin. I really, really like your idea of this familiarity with the character that you have in fantasy in order to apply it for historical writing. And I really like your notion of pity for the villain, because sometimes as historians, we do complain a lot of the problem of judging past figures through contemporary standards, to what extent that's fair, to what extent that's anachronistic. And I think this way of thinking more about pity for the fact that this bad thing happened might be more useful. But I would like to try something into that. because I also grew up with Tolkien. Lord of the Rings is probably the films that I have seen the most times in my life. I think that it goes beyond all the fingers in my body, how many times I have seen those movies. And the thing is that it gives me the impression that when Tolkien uses this notion of pity, it's useful to use it in the case of Tolkien because you have a greater evil from which to use it, right? So he has pity for Gollum because in the end, Gollum is also a victim of the ring. He has pity for Denethor because in the end, Denethor is a victim of Sauron's manipulations and the death of his son. So the thing is that, of course, in this fantasy world, even for Sauron, you can have it if you go back enough on the lore, but that's not relevant. But Sauron serves as this absolute evil to which you cannot really feel pity to. It's actually the greatest evil through which everything is compared through, and through which this manipulation that takes, you can feel pity for that. And the thing is that when using it for history, that's complicated in some cases because sometimes you don't have that greater evil that allows you for the pity. Again, this is more like a rambling of various ideas, so I don't think how coherent I'm being, but think about slavery. You can feel pity for the slave, but for slavery, there's no this larger thing, I would claim, that allows for this exercise. So I would say that, yes, I really like this idea for the pity, for the villain, but I would like to know your opinion about these little notions when actually engaging with history, because history impacts actual people. It's not the same way that fantasy does so.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I take it to be the question is mainly about how do we deal with sort of structural evil as opposed to individual evil. It's really easy to identify a solitary villain, Sauron being a wonderful example. And Gandalf actually at one point in kind of verbal sparring with Denethor identifies that he has pity for Sauron's slaves, referring to humans who were enslaved to the will of Sauron. So in one sense, yeah, what standard are we using and how do we deal with structures? I would say for both Lewis and Tolkien, it's fair, and Collingwood, it's fairly simple. They believe in they are all Christians. They believe that there is a spiritual evil and a spiritual good. And within the Catholic schema, which Tolkien adheres to, that sort of theme makes sense. Sort of free will, and that one could have willed not to sin, depending on your position on Augustinianism. But how do we historians deal with it if we aren't relying on some greater moral order? I think there are a couple of ways forward. We can implicitly assume a moral order. This is done a lot, and we often don't realize it. By our moral judgments, we are assuming a moral order. We just don't state what it is. Whether that's God or otherwise, it isn't particularly relevant. I think here of his name is Václav Havel, and the idea, the kind of post-Soviet existentialism, the emphasis on responsibility, that it is in fact the responsibility of those who, let's say, slaveholders in this case, it was their responsibility not to be slaveholders. However, the social situations which prevailed at any given time, if one were in Imperial Rome, slavery would be the norm. While there is a moral imperative to not be a slaveholder, this may not be seen. And in fact, the early church up through the 4th century, abolitionism isn't a category. It's not even a conceivable category for centuries. That something has to change in society. So we can do, it is a pity that society was formed in such a way that slavery would be acceptable for so long. while still recognizing slavery is still wrong. Is that addressing the question, or am I too far off?
No, you are addressing it. Don't worry about it.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we have a question from Paul Chilag.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, having troubles there. Thank you for the great presentations, really enjoyed all of them. And my question goes to Peter, actually, because during your presentation, I was thinking of all the games I personally played, like Sacred 2 or Dragon Age or Skyrim, really all of them. And there was always the choice, am I a good magician or a Templar or something in that regard, or am I a Negromancer? And now I'm really interested in the motivation of the gamers for which the motivation they have to make a decision on which performance they are choosing. So why do they want to become a Negromancer, or why do they want to become, let's say, a Templar or a priest? Is there some animosity towards the church, for example, or is there some narcissistic dream of becoming a powerful necromancer in opposition to the church, or is that going too far as an interpretation? So I was wondering if you thought about that, or what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks, Paul, for that question. It's a rather hard one because, yeah, I have thought about it, and that's one of the questions I would like to answer in my further research, because I think that is, well, with the method or concept or whatever you call it of performativity, I think you could answer those questions by asking players, by letting them play, asking them, looking at what they really do, what they really feel, because I think it's still a question which isn't really answered. It's always there. It's gamings are power fantasies. The church is evil. We always do want to overthrow the church, which is I don't know if you know the meme of Crusader Kings 3 where someone ate the Pope or whatever for cannibalism, because it is throughout games, if it's fantasy, if it's medieval, if it's contemporary history, it's always about the church could be bad or is bad, or is most of players are bad, but there's still a question, are these most of the players, or is just a small, loud, mass of players? So yeah, I think that's all I can say. I'd like to ask those questions, but I don't really know.
Okay, do we have other questions? I don't see. Yes, Juan Manuel.
Yeah, I mean, I also had a question for Peter. I really like this element of embodiment that you mentioned. It reminded me of something that I read a couple of months back from a very old book, like from 2003. This volume, the Video Game Theory Reader, they had also a paper on the issue of embodiment in video games. And I remember that in that article, the author mentioned that one of the interesting things about games in this sense is that the argument went on the lines that when you, for example, are playing a game and you jump in a game, the process in your brain that activates is the same as if you were to jump physically, just that you're not doing the action. Hence the very strong embodiment between both that simulation allows for. From that perspective, my question would be, if you in the game that you showed us and the different performativities behind this idea of dark magic, precisely about those physical cues that also play a part in this embodiment, the animation, the colors, the sound, everything that would give you in the real world those cues for you to act physically. How do you see in this case, of course, how does this would fit in the larger representation of magic, fantasy, Middle Ages, etc.? precisely these physical quote unquote actions, the animation of the character. What does he doing when he's casting the spells? What are the sounds and what are the colors that are coming to the screen? So I would like to know your opinion about how this plays a role into this.
I think it plays a role with the whole concept of the immersive fallacy, because we could just look at classical RPGs like I presented the Divinity Original Sin, where those small characters do things like casting their hands around and throwing ice balls, but it's different when you're into a virtual reality experience, for example, and you're really throwing that around. However, that still can feel less, it's less of an embodiment than for example, pressing 2 buttons when all the other parts of the experience aren't that polished or aren't that well fit. Because I think when you play role-playing games, it's very much about the story, the feeling, how the character fits into yourself, how you can define that character, how you can work that character around. Whereas, for example, in a virtual experience I just played a few days ago, The Mage's Tale by In Exile, where you have a very small you can't really customize yourself, because it's really yourself. You're standing in a virtual reality and you can choose between 3 spells, and that's about it. And there the magic actually really the magic dissolves rather quickly. You see that it's just, it's a simulation where I throw around some stuff which are pixels, whereas in less maybe virtual, less sophisticated realities, it can work quite fine. So yeah, embodiment always is one part, but the central things, as I try to explain, such as sound, how things are presented, how does it look, how it is placed into the story, plays one other major part. I hope I answered your question.
Do we have other questions? Or I see that there are 2 comments by Francis Mikus sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, in the chat. Interesting to see all 3 papers are discussing a sense of morality. I don't know if you want to discuss that, or I don't know. Francis Mikus, if you want to ask a question, or...
Wait, because you're muted. Give me a moment. Wait, no, I made a mistake. Give me a moment. Francis, there you are. There.
Nice.
No, but we cannot hear you. Yeah. Maybe you deactivated the microphone in your laptop, not just from Zoom.
Sorry.
Francis, we cannot hear you. No, maybe he cannot hear us either.
No, I think he can't. And he's speaking still.
Well,
pity.
Yeah, I mean, again, Fran, okay, let me send him a private message.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, if there are any other questions or comments for our panelists, again, also remember the panelists, you can also ask questions among yourselves in case there's something that you would like to go deeper into your colleagues' papers. Well, if there are not, then I believe we can leave the session there. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Eloise, for sharing this great session. For those of you who would like to stay a little longer, remember that we have our Topia space for those to continue the discussion on maybe things that we didn't have the time to address here. And tomorrow we have our first panel at 9 in the morning, which is Medieval Digital Humanities, the first of 2 panels. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.